Welcome again. It's nice to see what are beginning to be familiar faces here, and I'm delighted that you're hanging in there with me. Today, we're moving from looking at Miguel Covarrubias to actually a good friend of his, which I'll explain as the talk goes on, to a man named René Noncore. In the United States, they pronounce it Noncore, but I'm going to go with the French. So, are we all right? And I'd like you to take a minute to read this quote from Time magazine, because it sets the context for what I'm going to be talking about today, and actually next week as well. So Manhattan's Museum of Modern Art is also a museum of esoteric art. So this was written in 1954, so esoteric had a particular meaning then, referring to the exotic, as well as they say, sophisticated art. So modern art at that time was also considered to be rather esoteric. So both sophisticated and primitive. Among its most celebrated shows in the past were a survey of North American Indian artifacts, which visitors found hardly more savage than Picasso, and arts of the South Seas, which were no more baffling to the general public than Dali's Dreams or Henry Moore's hole-in-the-head idols. This was in reference to another exhibit that I'll talk about at the end of the day about art of the Andes. But first of all, I wanted you to read this because some of you may find it surprising to know that the Museum of Modern Art was showing exhibits of non-Western art. And indeed, that's what I want to focus on today, through looking at one particular individual, René Noncore, who was born in 1901 and died relatively young in 1968. So let me begin by telling you why I became interested in René Noncore. In 2009-2010, I was a visiting research scholar at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles, a center focused primarily on art historical research, but that has also been very inclusive of anthropologists who are interested in art. The research theme while I was there was the display of art. And I had proposed a project that focused on the creation of the Museum of Primitive Art in New York City, which happened in 1957, and its display of non-Western art. A man named René Noncore, a founder of the museum, along with Nelson Rockefeller, was responsible for both the installations at this new museum and the exhibits of non-Western art at the Museum of Modern Art that we've just talked about in that Time magazine quote. So the success of Noncore's exhibits in the late 1950s and 60s created many new viewers who learned to appreciate the category and the objects that became known as primitive art. As the art historian Marianne Staniszewski reminds us, this may not be a name that's familiar to you, and it doesn't roll off my lips very quickly, but she has done a very important book for those of us interested in display. It's called The Power of Display, a history of installations at the Museum of Modern Art. She argued that a work of art is, when a work of art is publicly displayed, it almost never stands alone. So while a collector may collect individual items, when these items are put on view, particularly for the public, they're not an isolated item, but part of an exhibit. It is always an element within, this is a quote from Staniszewski, a permanent or temporary exhibition, created in accordance with historically determined and self-consciously staged installation conventions. Thus, exhibitions, like artworks themselves, represent what Staniszewski described as, quote, conscious and unconscious subjects, issues, and ideological agendas. Interestingly, the anthropologist Gregory Bateson had expressed a related idea when he wrote about René Darnoncourt's 1946 exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art on Art of the South Seas. Bateson said that the exhibit, quote, is itself a work of art and must be judged as such. We must first ask what sort of whole aesthetic experience is the spectator offered? By way of response, he said, I believe if my Sepik rivermen, and if you recall he worked among the Yatmal in New Guinea, could see the many objects which their tribe has contributed to the exhibit, they would be proud. It would please them, of course, to see that they are more highly honored than their less artistic neighbors. But more than this, I think that they might recognize themselves and say, yes, ourselves indeed. We are a warlike people, full of fight and lust. So I'll have more to say about this particular exhibit and Bateson's comments about it later. Right now, I want to return to Staniszewski's idea about exhibition installations as cultural representations. And she's arguing that they've been occluded in the history of art, that at the time she published this book in 1998, she felt that they had been underrepresented in terms of art historians' thoughts about them. It was important, she argued, to consider museum installations as a subject of analysis in order to acknowledge the vitality, the historicity, and the time and site-bound character of all aspects of culture. So here she was talking about Western culture and museum practice. But I think we could make a similar point about the public display of art objects with regard to non-Western contexts, especially objects made for rituals. So I'm just kind of playing with this idea here. What would the anthropological study of the display of art look like? Wouldn't a cross-cultural anthropology of display analyze such social context of display as the Mullinguns that we talked about earlier, of New Ireland, or the facades of newly decorated Abelam House Tambran? Here we don't have a facade, but we have the interior, but this is also a display that was being presented to initiates. Or the yams that were on public display that the Abelam decorated. Finally, though we didn't talk about this earlier, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Asmat beast poles, which are also made to be put on display. So these are examples that I'm familiar with from Melanesia, from New Guinea, where objects weren't made just to be one isolated object, but they were to be seen together. And so I do think that we could think more broadly about the role that display plays in the meaning of objects, not just within the West. These are all forms of the display of art objects whose public display is meant to affect something in the viewer, to go back to Gell's term of agency. And shouldn't the anthropology of display also include performance as an important dimension of the art of display, especially since so many non-Western art objects are made to be worn for dance performances at rituals? And I'm thinking here, for example, about Holger Jebben's article and discussion about West New Britain dance masks, and his argument that their makers are objectifying their traditional culture through the renewed construction and performance of the mask. So again, these objects were made to be performed, and performance is a kind of display. Thus today, I'll not only focus on René Darnoncourt and his innovative role as a museum curator, I'll also be arguing that the history of the transformation of non-Western objects from ethnographic objects into objects of fine art involved a transformation in the way Westerners have displayed them. So I've been trying over the past few weeks to historicize different moments and different processes in which these same objects have gone from being ethnographic objects to objects of fine art. And today I'm going to concentrate on thinking about the display of these objects. Moreover, I'll be suggesting that display has always been an integral part of how art objects convey their meaning. Even before Staniszewski published her study of museum installation in 1998, anthropologists such as Ivan Karp, James Clifford, Sally Price, and more recently Robert Foster have all studied museum exhibitions, and museum anthropology has become a subfield of anthropology concerned, among other things, with the explication of exhibitions. Coincidentally, both Robert Foster and I have simultaneously focused on the work of René Darnoncourt, albeit for slightly different reasons. However, art historians such as Staniszewski and Jackson Rushing, an art historian of Native American art, had already singled him out because of the critical impact of his installations of non-Western art at the Museum of Modern Art. Jackson, in particular, attributed Darnoncourt's work with the aestheticization of Native American artifacts. So here I have a quote from Jackson Rushing's study, Native American Art and the New York Avant-Garde, a really interesting study of the transformation of Native American objects into art. And so he said that this process that he's calling aestheticization is the authoritative validation of objects as intrinsically fine works of American art, worthy of modern consideration. And this process, he said, began with their placement in Manhattan's sleek Museum of Modern Art. So again, the institution plays an important part, that it too had a role to play. And this is an example of the kind of aestheticization that he was referring to. This is a display of Hopi Kachina masks and Pueblo pottery from the 1941 exhibit of Native American art in the United States at the Museum of Modern Art, curated by René Darnoncourt, and I'll be talking more about this exhibit today. And of course, this contrasted with the kind of ethnographic display of objects that, again, in this picture, of course, it's not Native American, so I don't have a direct parallel, but this was typical of ethnographic museums at the time and their display of objects. So, here's a list of some of the exhibitions that René Darnoncourt curated, and I'm going to varying degrees, be talking about those exhibits that are in red, because those are the exhibits that he organized, curated, that had to do with non-Western objects. So you can see that he had quite an extensive career. We've got 37 years there in which he's been curating exhibits. So let me talk a little bit about Darnoncourt and how he got to be curating these exhibits. Count René Darnoncourt was born in Vienna, in 1901, and he was the son of an Austrian nobleman who lost his fortune as a result of the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the turn of the century. He was, Darnoncourt, educated in the city of Graz, surrounded there by one of Europe's largest museum complexes, I may not be pronouncing this correctly, so if there's someone who's familiar with it, they could tell me, Joanneum, a museum dedicated to folk art. Although he studied chemical engineering, he was always interested in art, and as a student had organized an exhibit of modern artists such as Picasso. And then in 1925, he traveled to Paris, where he most likely saw this exposition Universal des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels Modernes that I had talked some about last week, dedicated to Art Deco and the display of modern decorative arts. Parisian department stores had boutiques at the exposition that featured innovative window displays based on the work of Cubist and avant-garde artists, a feature that received worldwide publicity, and here's just one example. These were a new kind of mannequin created out of wax by a man named Pierre Imams that were talked about a lot at this exposition. And that had repercussions in terms of department stores worldwide, including Fifth Avenue department stores in New York City. I mentioned both the Folk Art Museum and this Paris exposition because they were formative influences on Darnancour's later museum career. The impoverished young Darnancour decided to immigrate to Mexico in 1926, hoping to find work as a mining engineer. Arriving in Mexico penniless, he initially supported himself by selling sketches of local people that he had drawn. And eventually he took all these sketches and published them in a book called Mexicana. So he had always had a talent for drawing. These are doodles of his. I don't know if you know that American word for doodle, for doing, maybe some of you are doodling as I'm talking today, just drawing there in the margins on your notes. Darnancour was famous for doing these doodles, and these are actually doodles of his that were collected from meetings at the Museum of Modern Art and finally put into a book. So these must have been long meetings because these are pretty complex doodles. This talent that he had, this ability to draw, took him in a totally different direction than his degree in mining and mining engineering. In Mexico City, he became involved in the sale of pre-Columbian and Mexican folk art at a shop run by an expatriate American silversmith and art dealer, a man named Fred Davis, who became famous in his own right for reviving, he and another man named Spratling, for reviving Mexican silver work. And making it popular among American and other European Western tourists. So Davis had a store, and he hired Darnancour to do store windows and to curate exhibits of modern Mexican artists such as Rivera, Tamayo, Orozco, and Miguel Covarrubias. He also advised the influential American collectors, Dwight Morrow, who happened to be the U.S. ambassador to Mexico, and his wife, Elizabeth. The next picture that I'm going to show you is one of a Mexico City puppet artist. And here's the artist, and this is a puppet that he did of Darnancour. And I included that just to show you that Darnancour became a well-known figure in Mexico City, in part because he was very imposing. He was 6'5" in height. He got to know, as I said, the American ambassador, who was there in Mexico from 1927 to 1930. The ambassador, in part, I think, probably to help Darnancour out, had hired him to do murals. So these are murals that he painted at the Morrow's home or their country home in Cuernavaca. And Dwight Morrow's wife, Elizabeth Morrow, was a writer of children's books. She asked Darnancour to illustrate one called The Painted Pig. So what you see in this children's book is an interest that Darnancour had in folk art. The Mexican pig was an object that he collected throughout Mexico and was selling in Fred Davis's store. Darnancourt worked for Fred Davis from 1927 until 1933, and this was a period of great intellectual and artistic activity in Mexico City. Darnancourt knew all the important people, both Mexican and expatriate there, and as he later reminisced, he said, "Mexico was really terribly exciting around 1928-29. The nation's whole intelligentsia felt very strongly that this was a period of great social and artistic and intellectual revival. Add to that the fact that things were so picturesque, a lot of little revolutions were going on, and the result was a rather interesting unrest." Kind of the a little bit of a patronizing attitude here, but nonetheless, he does convey that he was very excited about being in Mexico at this time. And these next pictures are by two famous photographers, one Tina Modotti and the other Edward Weston, who were friends of Darnancourt. And Weston and Darnancourt would go out they would travel to villages in the surrounding area to collect folk art that Weston collected for himself. Darnancourt was bringing it into the store in Mexico City. So here's another of Weston's photographs. These are painted gourds. And while Davis was attracted to Darnancourt's aristocratic air, which he knew would appeal to customers, but also to his talented eye for quality. Not only was Darnancourt a tireless and talented collector, he was also hard to miss, as he was, as I said, this lanky 6'5". That was a quote from Fred Davis. As one acquaintance noted, René's real talent appeared when he went out to buy for the shop. Astride tiny horses with his knees knocking at his chin, he rode rocky trails to whatever good workmen were making things. An example of his local renown and popularity can be seen, as he said, in these photographs of the puppet that I showed you earlier. As a result of the trips, Darnancourt became involved with encouraging the revival of certain specialized craft traditions. And this is an object that is lacquerware made in the shape of a gourd, and it's an example of the kind of lacquerware from a place called Olinala, that Darnancourt was responsible for reviving. So what he was able to do with support from Fred Davis was assure the craftsmen that if they took the time to make really good objects, he would purchase them and sell them in Mexico City. So why I'm going into this in a little bit of detail is it also became an important part of Darnancourt's later career. So he spent a lot of time encouraging various craftsmen, including these craftsmen in the village of Olinal. And with this, not only did the lacquerware sell well, and thus provide much needed income for the villagers, it also contributed to the new government's nationalistic goals of promoting traditional Mexican crafts and a sense of pride in Mexican indigenous cultures. So if you recall, last week I was talking about the interest that Covarrubias and other artists like Rivera had in looking at this Mexicanness of traditional crafts and pre-Columbian art. And I was talking with a woman in the audience, I'm not sure if she's here today, about how even earlier than this period of time, that interest had started within Mexican government. Because of his widespread knowledge of Mexican folk art and his amiable, well-educated manner, when U.S. Ambassador Morrow was able to convince the Carnegie Foundation to fund a traveling exhibition of Mexican arts to the United States in the late 1920s, he asked Darnancourt to curate it. So Morrow goes to Darnancourt, asks him to curate this exhibit to take to the United States. Noncore goes and asks Mexicans like Covarrubias to help him. The exhibition was to function as a means of cultural diplomacy, introducing people in the United States to the wealth of different styles of art, past and present, produced by their neighbors south of the border. It was an early example of what the United States government came to call the good neighbor policy. So I'm interested here in talking a little bit about the role in which art and exhibitions of art had a political purpose to play. Franklin Roosevelt's foreign policy towards Latin America in the 1930s was called the Good Neighbor Policy, and the United States was particularly concerned at this point in time because many Americans did not look favorably on Mexico, were concerned about the revolution that had happened there, and there was also the potential of a socialist government taking over in Mexico, and so the United States wanted to have friendly relations with more pro-democracy leaders there. So Noncore curates this exhibit, and with the help of the Mexican advisors, he took this exhibit on the road to 14 different cities in the United States, and he called it a Mexican interpretation of Mexico. So he wrote in the introduction to the exhibition catalog that this is an exhibition of Mexican arts, not arts of Mexico. Many art objects are produced within the physical limits of the Republic that are Mexican only in a geographic sense, but the unassimilated copies of foreign models must be disregarded for the purpose of this exhibition. So colonial impact, as I had talked about before, about Spain and France, was present in many objects in Mexico, but this exhibit was trying to filter those objects out and show just those things that were past and present Mexican. The sentiments that Noncore was expressing here fit clearly with the aims of the Mexican government to promote indigenous Mexican arts, and to eschew, as I just said, those aspects of Mexican culture that were foreign. The exhibition displayed items of folk art such as ceramics, basketry, weaving, leatherwork, papier-mâché, as well as the contemporary work of artists such as Rivera, Orozco, and Covarrubias, all of whom were intent on promoting their understanding of a truly Mexican identity and heritage. It was the experience of installing this exhibition in 14 different locations that was the basis, and this is a quote, of Noncore's incomparable mastery of the aesthetics of exhibition. So here's another picture of that exhibit. These are all from the Met. And here we have one a painting, this one by Covarrubias, called The Bone, El Hueso, which was, you can see the bone there in the picture. It was a portrait of a local politician in rural Mexico, and it was Covarrubias's dig at the graft and corruption that sometimes followed these local politicians who the bone is that they would use their position to help themselves and their friends. It was this exhibition, too, that first brought Noncore to the attention of important museum people in New York, such as the director of the Museum of Modern Art, Alfred Barr, who was, quote, unquote, impressed as much by the installation, Barr later said, as by the art. Not all reviewers at the time were equally impressed as Barr with the exhibition. A British critic wrote, "As the exhibition was installed at the Metropolitan Museum, it was a veritable confusion of Mexican arts. like a country fair, its arrangement, but without any of the local color which enlivens a real country fair. It gave one the intimate feeling of having been allowed in the gallery before the curators had started to arrange it, before the judges had eliminated a mass of insignificant clutter. As the late American art historian as the Latin American art historian James Oles later noted, such critiques reflect the end of exhibition design inaugurated by the Royal Kunstkammer and World's Fair displays, and the dawn of more modernist aesthetics in museum presentations. And there's another anecdote that goes with this display, which was that the director of the Metropolitan Museum was so taken aback by the objects that were put on display that he initially refused to mount the exhibit. He said, this is just a lot of truck, which is a slang word in American for, a lot of junk. But somewhat ironically, the exhibit turned out to be one of the most popular that year at the Metropolitan Museum. Darnoncourt's involvement with the revitalization of traditional indigenous Mexican folk art not only led to his work on the Mexican Arts Exhibition, it also brought him to the attention of John Collier, the United States Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Collier, here we have, an ardent advocate of American Indian rights, knew that it was important that the Indians have better economic control over their own lives, while being able to perpetuate as many of their traditional cultural practices as possible. So, for example, he was influential in having a law passed that permitted American Indians to continue their traditional religious practices, such as the peyote cult that you may have heard of. He had just created the Indian Arts and Crafts Board in 1936, and he wanted to have Darnoncore work with Native American craftsmen to help them revive the quality of their crafts in a similar manner to what Darnoncore had accomplished in Mexico. So here we see Collier, head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, with some of the craftsmen. In order to perform his duties as general manager of the Indian Arts and Crafts Board, Darnoncore felt that it was imperative that he get to know representatives of each of the more than 200 different tribal groups that the board served. So he embarked on an extensive period of field work in which he traveled across country, meeting artisans from various tribes, from Alaska to Florida, Maine to the Southwest. He also hired numerous anthropologists to help him with projects, working with local groups of Native Americans. And here's the legacy of some of this work. It's a museum called the Southern Plains Indian Museum, and you can read it. It says the United States Department of the Interior, Indian Arts and Crafts Board. So this is still something that's ongoing today, the result of this work that Darnoncore undertook with the Indian Arts and Crafts Board. So, in 1937, Darnoncore was invited by the U.S. Commission for the Golden Gate International Exposition. So you can't get away from this exposition that I've been talking about. We're going to go back to that same colonial exposition in San Francisco. And this time we're going to look at a third exhibit that was there in San Francisco, in addition to the two that I talked about, Covarrubias's murals and the Pacific Arts exhibit. Here we have some posters from what was called the Indian Court at the Federal Building that Darnoncore curated. The official aim of the exhibition was to produce a new appreciation of the proud Indian heritage among the American public, as well as to demonstrate that contemporary Indians possessed values needed by modern civilization. So if you'll think back to what I've been talking about, Covarrubias's aims and the whole Pacific unity idea at the Golden Gate International Exposition, you'll see that what Darnoncore was tasked with was a part of a similar idea, while there was war that was stirring in Europe, the United States was attempting to focus on its own cultural heritage, its indigenous heritage, in the same way that Mexicans were in Mexico. And this federal project for this exhibit was part of it. Eleanor Roosevelt was involved. She became interested in the success of the exhibition. Here's the federal building. So it was a huge building when the centerpiece of this federal building was the Indian Court. It was the first time in history that the United States government had given the Indians a place of honor at an international exposition, rather than being a sideshow attraction. It was said that thousands of visitors acquired an appreciation of the dignity, beauty, and utility of Indian handicrafts, and the sale of their work contributed to the goal of the Indian Arts and Crafts Board of fostering economic independence for Native Americans. Noncore enlisted the aid of two anthropologists, George Valiant and Frederick Douglass, so he realized that his background wasn't expertise in Native American work. And they supplied the scholarly information about Native American cultures while Noncore designed the installation. He very cleverly used an Indian poster design contest to give early public exposure to the variety and quality of the Indian arts to be on display at the exposition. So I'm going to jump here because I got these in the wrong order. Here I'm going to show you some of these posters, which actually are still available for sale in the United States. They found a renewed interest among the American public. So all of the entries in the competition were put on display at the San Francisco Museum of Art to publicize it. As for the exhibition itself, so here I'll just show you these different, so each one of these posters focused on a different cultural region. Here we have the Taos Pueblo turtle dance, and there's a Taos Pueblo in the background. This was the winner of the exposition, first prize. Here was a Plains Indian antelope hunt. It's a Northwest Coast design from a Haida Indian blanket. Noncore also wrote articles about the Indian arts for various publications, and I included this so that you could see the kind of Haida Indian blanket that poster design was taken from. An Alaskan Inuit mask, and finally this was a painting of a buffalo hunt. Noncore said that a trip through the exhibit will reveal to the visitor the amazing variety and vitality of the arts and cultures of Indian America. But it also endeavors to link the objects together in such a way that gives the visitor a unified picture of the people who produced them. So this was some of his attempt at giving some ethnographic context to these objects. This was a far different goal than any previous exhibit of Native American arts or crafts had attempted. And Noncore identified three coordinating elements underlying the design of the exhibition. So I'm going to, since I wanted to focus on this whole idea of exhibition, design, Noncore was quite articulate about what he was trying to do in the creation of his exhibits, and so I'm going to be focusing on different elements of this. So the first thing was maps. They were to be used to orient the visitor, constantly relating each object or display to the entire geographic area portrayed in the exposition. Makes sense to us. The other reason why I'm doing this is that I want to contrast this idea of aestheticization that I talked about earlier, that Noncore is often talked about, such as in the Rushing quote. And part of what I'm interested in showing is that Noncore was a lot more complex in the way in which he designed his exhibits. So, maps. dramatic visual form that would allow and accentuate the physical transitions from one culture area display to another. This most often took the form of dramatic contrasts in lighting and color of the exhibit walls, and then display methods that would relate aesthetic forms and choice of raw materials and production methods to the basic elements that condition a particular culture. Thus, for example, and I don't have a picture of this, but instead we're looking at a Plains Indian example, Northwest coast objects, such as paintings and carvings associated with the sea, were carefully chosen and displayed for dramatic and organic unity. And there were also, so there were 15 galleries and a court that presented 8 general areas of Indian cultures, differentiated by the architecture, color schemes, lighting, and type of displays in each room. Thus, both ethnographic concerns, such as I talked about, the relationship between a culture and its environment, and exhibitionary concerns, how to capture the viewer's attention, were taken into consideration. This latter aspect, Darnancourt may have developed in Mexico, designing the store windows for Fred Davis, as well as ideas that he might have seen when he was back in Paris in 1925. The exhibition ended with actual craftsmen producing such items. Here is a Navajo painter, and his paintings were for sale. While verging on an objectification of the other, care was taken to ensure that the Indian participants were not treated like specimens in human zoos, the carnivalesque type of display that I talked about earlier, in earlier decades. For example, when Eleanor Roosevelt, and here we see her, greeted the husband and wife who were representing the Blackfoot tribe, it was the 3 of them interacting as equals. So there were attempts at showing photographs like this with the wife of the President of the United States, meeting the Indians and appreciating their work. The commercial aspect of the exhibition, with its focus on artifacts as commodities, was important to Darnancourt, since the goal of the Indian Arts and Crafts Board was to revive traditional art forms and ensure their continuity and the high quality of their craftsmanship by finding ways to transform them into objects that would be of interest to contemporary collectors. However, as my colleague Robert Foster has recently pointed out, the 2 categories of art and commodity thus became very closely aligned with this exhibitionary frame. Critics such as Alfred Frankenstein, writing about the exhibition for the San Francisco Chronicle, noted that its main stress was upon aesthetic values, and secondary stress was upon anthropology. Writing in the Los Angeles Times, Arthur Miller proclaimed, this isn't Arthur Miller the playwright, every museum official in America could learn from Darnancourt's showmanship and imaginative installations, the latter being based on a cunning arrangement of the objects. Even the noted American anthropologist Alfred Kroeber had praise for the exhibit. He believed that, quote, Darnancourt's display of Indian material were without question the finest he had ever seen. He wrote glowingly to John Collier that Darnancourt had the incredible faculty of giving his arrangements the supreme aesthetic touch, as well as complete originality, while still being authentic reflections of the diversity of Indian life and subtly effective. This was high praise indeed from a man considered to be the expert at the time on North American Indian cultures. Well, the success of this exhibit in San Francisco led to an invitation from Alfred Barr, who was then the director of the Museum of Modern Art, to mount a similar exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art. So here's the poster for the exhibit that was 2 years later. They changed the name. In New York, the exhibition was retitled Indian Art of the United States, rather than its former, more inclusive title, Indian Arts in North America. The narrower nationalistic focus reflected Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal politics that still held considerable sway in Washington, D.C. So the idea was that the Museum of Modern Art wanted people to be aware that they are talking about North America. The United States, not North America, not including Canada. Behind the statement was, along similar lines, Darnancour's statement in the catalog that accompanied the exhibit. He said, Indian art constitutes part of the artistic and spiritual wealth of this country. And I want to emphasize that because there was in Darnancour a sense that the United States didn't value and appreciate enough its own cultural heritage. And interestingly, it may have taken someone who was not American himself, someone who was foreign-born, someone who was from Europe, who was, one, able to pick up that idea and express it, and two, that may have also helped Americans to have a foreigner, a European, because it's hard sometimes for us, both in the United States and Europe, to realize that prior to World War II, the United States was still in the shadow of Europe in terms of the sense of what was seen to be important in terms of high culture, in terms of cultural values, in terms of aesthetics. So what Darnancour was attempting to do, and I think it was in part his experience in Mexico, and as well as his experience with Native Americans, was to give the United States public a different sense of the importance of Native American art. When the exhibition opened at the Museum of Modern Art in 1941, it was hailed by the mainstream press as one of the most provocative and acclaimed exhibitions in the then young life of this increasingly powerful institution. So this is a quote. It's interesting to note that although American Indian artifacts had been on display for many years in New York City at the American Museum of Natural History, there was something dramatic and enticing about Darnancour's exhibitions that attracted the public and offered them a new way of seeing the very same objects. The exhibition began at the main entrance. I was going to show you this, similar to the poster, but this is the cover of the catalog from the exhibit. And as one reviewer in The Nation, which is a somewhat left-wing newspaper or journal in the United States, a progressive weekly publication, noted, the bear on the cover of the exhibition catalog is from a Native American shield and depicts a bear, symbolic of the Native Americans, charging into a salvo of American cavalry bullets. Nowhere in Darnancour's exhibit, the reviewer pointed out, was any of this history explained, nor was there any reference to how many of the objects in the exhibit had been acquired as war booty by the American military. On the other hand, Darnancour felt that he was introducing the public to greater appreciation of Native American cultures, and along with Collier, hoping that this appreciation would help Native Americans improve their lives. This is the outside of the Museum of Modern Art in 1941, and it must have been pretty imposing to be walking down 53rd Street in New York and see a big Northwest Coast totem pole there in front of the museum. There were 3 floors of exhibits. Oh, I wanted to point out one other thing about the totem pole. One critic immediately made a link between Native American art when he saw this totem pole and modern art, specifically surrealist art, with the observation that other totem poles in the exhibit rise like a surrealist forest inside the museum. So there was this play in Darnancore's exhibitions with attempting to have dramatic effects of these objects. At the same time, as he did in San Francisco, there were maps that were showing the different culture areas. He was delighted that there were 3 floors, that the entire museum was given over to the exhibit. But here we begin to see, the effects of his more aesthetic display of objects. So the displays, there was a minimal number of objects. There were simple pedestals, cases standing before plain walls, thus lending to the artwork, as Darnancore explained, the type of dignity usually associated with the work of the classics. So he was very consciously attempting to single out these objects and to highlight their beauty, their aesthetic value. The only exceptions to this decontextualization of objects on the 3rd floor were the introductory gallery, which had the maps that I showed you and other didactic material. As well as a gallery that consisted of a series of kiva-like spaces, these sacred, Hopi ritual sacred spaces that were dug into the ground, out of which the masked kachinas would appear. The 2nd floor had exhibits of historic cultures displayed under the heading Living Traditions. I'm going to go through this a little quickly, just give you some ideas of the ways in which these objects, these are Mimbres pottery, were being displayed. That's actually from the archaic. That was on the 3rd floor. Here we get to the 2nd floor with living traditions, masks, the Hopi Kachina masks displayed along with Pueblo pottery. As in San Francisco, there were actual artists who were brought to New York, and here you see Navajo sand painters who were there on display for Americans to see them creating this ephemeral art that was temporary. Once again, Eleanor Roosevelt shows up and meets the artists. In writing about the significance of the exhibit to the changing status of Native American art, I had noted Rushing's quote that the process of aestheticization began with he believes that it began with this exhibit. Commenting on the San Francisco exhibit, Darnancore had written that the affinity of primitive art was discovered 20 years ago when African carvings and oceanic vessels were first used as accessories to modern interior decorations in Paris. So this is a specific quote from Darnancore that refers back to that 1925 exhibit that I was talking about. Since then, the work of all primitive artists the world over has been used for the same purpose, with the exception of the projects of the American Indian that were relegated to museums and curio stores. So here again is Darnancore saying, look what was going on over in Europe and their recognition of the art of Oceania and Africa. You in the United States, you haven't realized, what you have here in terms of Native American art. Among the many New Yorkers who went to see the Indian art of the United States exhibit was a young American artist named Jackson Pollock. And before I talk about Pollock, I have one other slide that I want to show you, which was the closing gallery in the 1941 New York exhibit. So just like in San Francisco, there was an attempt to get people to think about how Native American art could be used in a contemporary modern home. And there were objects that were there for sale. And I think my colleague Robert Foster has been very prescient in suggesting maybe this was the beginning of the exit through the museum shop idea. At the time, Darnancourt, when he curated this exhibit, was still in the employ of the Indian Arts and Crafts Board. So he was fulfilling his job of creating a new market and interest in Americans for Indian art. So let's switch to one of the people who were very influenced by this exhibit, the artist Jackson Pollock, who many of you may know through his very famous drip paintings. Jackson grew up in the western United States, had always been fascinated with Native American cultures, especially Pueblo and Northwest Coast Indians, their arts and rituals. The interest for Pollock lay largely in a sense that he had, and one that was shared by other avant-garde artists and critics in New York, that the art of primitive races has a highly evocative quality, which allows it to bring to our consciousness the clarities of the unconscious mind. So here is another statement of the idea that I was talking about again of primitivism, the ways in which modern artists were influenced by non-Western art, but this is the first example that we have of an American modern artist referring back to Native American artists. And he very specifically felt, this picture is called Totems. He felt when he saw those sand paintings being done by the Navajo artists, he saw a direct connection between what he was doing when he dripped paint on his canvases. So, while it surprised me, I must say, when I first read about what Pollock thought he was doing with his drip paintings, that he related this back to those Navajo sand paintings. And he felt that in doing his drip paintings, that there was a ritual aspect to his whole art. So it wasn't for him, just affinity. It was something that he saw that there was, that both, he was also very interested in shamans and studied a lot about shaman tradition within Native Americans and felt that artists were shamans. So I'm going to just jump ahead because I do want to talk some about one more exhibit of Darnancourt's, which was Arts of the South Seas. And so I'll truncate some of this, but here's Darnancourt doing the installation of Arts of the South Seas, which occurred in 1946 at the Museum of Modern Art. Here's the catalog from that exhibit, and like with the other Native American exhibit, he worked with with an anthropologist and an art historian who specialized in Oceania, and he asked his friend Miguel Covarrubias to do the drawings in the catalog. So here are two of Covarrubias' paintings in the catalog. And what I'd like to highlight here is that the way in which he integrated his interest in drawing and his talent in drawing with the creation of an exhibit. So the first thing that he would do, and these are his own drawings, he visited all of the different museums where he was going to collect items and drew each item, and he drew it to scale. And then he selected the items that he was going to put in any given room. And it's hard to see here, but for instance, this is the objects that he was going to put in the Sepik River Gallery. Each one of these objects underneath it not only has the acquisition number from whatever museum collection it has, but it also has the size. And so he was beginning to think in terms of the relationship between these objects and the different size of the objects. Then he would do a sketch of the actual gallery so that he would begin to visualize how the objects were going to look in a room. Then he painted a watercolor drawing so he could begin to see what the different colors in the room were going to look like. And the colors were very important because this is a color wheel, and the Museum of Modern Art wouldn't let me, I mean, this is what I could reproduce from their archive, so you can't see the actual colors, and it doesn't reproduce very well, but this is a color wheel in which he said, here we have the coral atolls, and then over here we have the darker greens with the jungle, and up there we're Australia. So he had a color wheel. It reminds me of the Goethe wheel that I've seen here. Of all the different colors that were going to be used. Then finally he did a drawing that showed the flow of how a visitor would go through the gallery. They would start in Australia, they would go then to New Caledonia, up to the Papuan Gulf, and all the way down, ending with Easter Island. So, and again, that was his own sketch, and then he put that drawing in the catalog, as well as this diagram, which showed for him different affinities in both style and history of contact among the different cultures. So, again, he also proposed the idea of vistas, which were, and here you can see some actual photographs of what the installations looked like. Here I wanted to emphasize the different colors that he used for different regions of the world. This is the Papuan Gulf. Here we have the Admiralty Islands. Here we have, actually we're getting into the Sepik. I didn't have any color photographs there. And this is the idea that I wanted to show you of these vistas and affinities. So he attempted to have no walls between some galleries, so that while you were in one gallery, you would see into the objects in another gallery. And he specifically put objects and culture areas next to each other that he felt there was some kind of affinity in the style of the objects. What I want to end up with was Gregory Bateson's comments about this exhibit. Bateson wrote, as I think I quoted earlier, he wrote a review of the exhibit, and he said that much of the emotional tenor, as well as the aesthetic experience of the exhibition itself, was a result of Darnoncourt's dramatic use of lighting that conveyed to the viewer something, and this is a quote from Bateson, something of the atmosphere of the places from which they come, something of the emotions which underlie the various cultural conventions which govern their making. Darnoncourt had successfully choreographed the lighting so that it was a performative element of the viewer's exhibitionary experience. So Bateson was very aware of the experience of that flow from one gallery to another. He commented on the transition from the first well-lit room that contained Australian objects. He said there were boomerangs, beautifully poised on a wire support, a few spear throwers, a series of North Queensland drawings out of full light, and then you go into murk, a violent but stylized phallicism. This is Bateson's terms, where the spectator is confronted with great-eyed figures carved out of the tree trunks of standing tree ferns, the standing slit gongs of the New Hebrides, and a row of heads, bright red and lit from below. This murk, he said, is appropriate to the ethos of these warlike, virile cultures, their secret men's societies and cult objects kept hidden from women and children. But when the spectator passes through into the Solomons and the Admiralty Islands, you recall I had showed you, if I can go back to that yellow of the Admiralty Islands, he steps into the brilliant lighting of island beaches, a light which in the Polynesian room, Bateson remarks, becomes almost painful in its sharpness. This shift in the intensity of the light, according to Bateson, goes with a total shift in the ethos of the art, from bold, blunt, anthropomorphic forms to fine, sharp profiles and sharp crescentic motifs of decorations. His use of the term ethos, many of you may realize, was based on his own theoretical work with the Apple, in which he attempted to understand the emotional tenor of a culture. But he was referring here to a rich spiral designs of Maori carvings. That was the crescentic. And the final gallery with its objects from Easter Island, which you see here. Including, he said, there were 2 dolls made from bark cloth that Bateson described as looking like crawling senescent embryos set up in an unlit box. So I don't have those here. There was another display case. They were the final items in the exhibit. Bateson felt that Noncore, whether or not he knew articulately what he was doing at each step, has shown quite extraordinary sensitivity to his material. He concluded his enthusiastic review by saying, if the spectator is merely there to enjoy an aesthetic experience, Noncore has succeeded as an artist in providing what was demanded. And perhaps no more should be demanded of a museum devoted to the arts. However, Bateson saw a lot more than that in the form of the exhibition. He said, writing as a scientist, I would say that consciously or unconsciously, Noncore has proposed a hypothesis about the psychological place of artistic emphases and conventions in human life. Commenting, this is Bateson, on the by then well-recognized Freudian notion that art is replete with a subconscious and in particular sexual themes, as well as acknowledging all that had been written, comparing primitive art with those modern movements in Western art that have articulately and consciously stressed those semi-conscious aspects of human life. Bateson went on to suggest that Noncore was proposing a hypothesis in this exhibit. His exhibit offers us a classification of some of the art styles of the South Seas, which suggests that these styles can be related severally to different phases of the human reproductive cycle. So Bateson saw in this exhibit, from the beginning to the end, a movement through the human reproductive cycle. Specifically, he said, the exhibit has a definite artistic form, a structure of climax, which he thought was the clue to its success. For Bateson, the exhibition's order expressed a collective unity based on the individual ethos of each culture. He was eager to find out what Noncore thought about this hypothesis. So he sent his review to Noncore before he published it. And not surprisingly, perhaps, Noncore found it difficult to agree with everything Bateson had read into the exhibition. For example, he said that the transition from the phallicism of the New Hebrides, if you remember, I talked about those tall fern-like, phallic statues, to the virility of the sepik, those warlike sepiks, was not planned. This was Noncore saying, but it sounds probable. However, he did not feel competent to judge the importance of the reproductive sequence Bateson suggested. Very diplomatically, but obviously with a lot of skepticism, he agreed that it might well be there, but perhaps it's not as important as you make out. Bateson, though, obviously excited by what Noncore had managed to convey in the exhibition, ended his review with the following remark. For the future, this means that a new field for collaborative work has become available. It is evidently important to bring together anthropological knowledge and artistic sensitivity. Such work may always require 2 persons, each with his special skill, and there will be pitfalls. But there is real hope that collaboration along these lines might lead to some advance in our understanding of the tangled emotional themes expressed in man's diverse artistic conventions. That's how he ended the review. And although we too may be skeptical of Bateson's psychoanalytically oriented symbolic analysis of the South Seas exhibition, nonetheless, in his enthusiasm for the installation as an artistic whole, we see an interesting attempt, I think, by an anthropologist to think about how a Western form of display might convey ethnographic meaning. Bateson, and I'll wrap this up now, Bateson made these remarks on this exhibit in 1946 after he himself had been asked by the Museum of Modern Art to curate an exhibit of Balinese art. So, in 1943, he curated an exhibit at MoMA titled Bali, Background for War. And its purpose was to acquaint Americans with a part of the world where they might soon be fighting. He wrote of the importance of the exhibition. It might be desirable to do this for all peoples of the world, to dissect in the form of an exhibition the characteristics of the Germans, the English, the Croats, even the Americans. The culture of a people cannot adequately be expressed in words. To adequately convey the feeling of a people, it's necessary to resort to their works of art and to photographs, which he was using in the Balinese exhibit, of their daily life. And here I am going to end with just a couple of comments about Noncore. Soon after Noncore's untimely death in 1968, he was hit by a car just after he had retired from the Museum of Modern Art. There was a memorial exhibition mounted in his honor at the Museum of Primitive Art, and it was titled The Art of Installation. And it was based on a book that Noncore was in the process of writing about his ideas about installation. So it was a tribute to his contribution as a museum curator. Like that exhibit, I focused on Noncore's installation of non-Western objects because I think his exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art were important taxonomic moments in the transformation of non-Western artifacts into objects of art in the United States. Besides highlighting the role of these exhibits, I've also focused on Noncore in order to make the following points. I've suggested that a focus on the anthropology of display amends Clifford's chronotype of collecting by broadening our focus from just a consideration of collecting to include the role that museum exhibitions played in shaping and encouraging artists, collectors, intellectuals, and the public to look anew at primitive art. And I've also argued that René Noncore's complex history of experimentation, so that it wasn't just the aestheticization, but there was also contextualization, was a result not only of his early experience as a designer of commercial displays of objects, but as importantly, his fieldwork in Mexico and his job with the Indian Arts and Crafts Board in the United States, where he studied the practices of indigenous artists by spending time with them. Added to these experiences were his associations, both professional and personal, with anthropologists. And I didn't mention, but his wife's sister was an anthropologist. In his own words, he curated the exhibits of non-Western art, including a final one on the art of the Andes. Here, I'll just show you that. In 1954, as well as one on Osmod art in 1962, at a time when the Museum of Modern Art was a laboratory in whose experiments the public was invited to participate. Ultimately, Noncore's exhibitionary practices were refined and streamlined by his relationship with modern art and the Museum of Modern Art's first director, Alfred Barr. And his prominent role at the Museum of Modern Art, where he became director in 1949, was the result of his friendship with the preeminent collector of both modern and primitive art, Nelson Rockefeller. And it's both of these individuals who I'll be talking about next week. So, thank you.